pretty great summer.
Oh, it's been an awesome summer.
How was your Raglan? How was your Raglan trip?
Fantastic. It says we're live, which is a good thing, but I can't see it come up on my. Gosh, it's so slow. Okay, so we're live. That's good. I can see you, buddy, and I can say hi to anybody who's in the chat. Crikey, Dick, it's Jimmy T. Hey, Jimmy T. Look, I'll just get it over and done with now, and people can watch the replays if they want. I put up a video earlier today saying sorry. Carla and I couldn't make yesterday's show, but we're here, which is good. And thanks for joining us, Jimmy T. So what have you been up to, buddy? The last couple of, actually, it's been, this is the first show of the year.
I think our last one was, what, a week before Christmas or 2 weeks?
Holy cow, probably
4 and 5 and 2. So we haven't done a show in 7 weeks.
No. So we've got a bit of work to do. I suppose what we should probably do is, if you just give me a second, I'll get myself stabilized here. So Carl and I want to do a couple of shows where we talk specifically about Brian Jones. Have we had shows in the past where we've spoken about Brian? I know that we'll probably do repetitions, but have we done anything specifically on Brian, Carl?
Not in depth. Just kind of talked about him in reference to him being in the band and particular individuals. Possibly talking about his blues influence, but not in depth as the individual, the character, the innovator, the originator.
Okay, well that's good. I'm kind of glad that we're doing that, and I suppose what's kind of motivated me into this position is one of the cats that watches us, Dave from England, who is a Stones nut, obviously, but more specifically a Brian Jones nut. And I've made no secret of the fact to you that I prefer the Mick Taylor years with the Rolling Stones. That's my pinnacle for me. But having said that, though, being a Stones nut, you can't discount Brian Jones's influence. And I'm going to be bold here and say that from the years of me knowing you're a Brian Jones nut.
Yeah, well, I was a big nut, and then as you learn about Mick Taylor and being into enjoying lead guitar, because Brian obviously wasn't a lead guitar player. I got to appreciate all the guys in different ways, but I've got a soft spot for Brian simply being he was there from the start. He was the identity and personality of that original rebellious group. I think that he was like a little pit bull walking around with an anchor. He really anchored that group with his vision. And looking back in hindsight, 50, 60 years later, you can't help but notice his influence not only on the Stones, but countless musicians, blues, rock, R&B, from a musical standpoint to a fashion standpoint to just being someone that, just a 60s icon. That's what he is.
Yeah, and I want to echo what you're saying too, because for me, an appreciation of Brian Jones has certainly developed over the last 5 years, and a lot of that has been because of the amount of good scholarly books and articles out there by dedicated fans who are writing from an informed perspective, which is good. You know that they're not repeating some of the rumors and some of the innuendo that we heard maybe 20 30 years ago. They're actually doing some research. And I suppose for me the big book for me was this Paul Trinker's book here, Sympathy for the Devil, the Brian Jones story. When I read that book, and a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about sort of comes from this book, it was a revelation for me, because it was a counterbalance to what Keith said in his book about Brian Jones. He doesn't say a lot of good things about Brian Jones in his book, and this certainly comes across as a counterweight. And I'd like to, without sounding egotistical, I'd like to think that our show in some kind of way too goes about helping that balance and putting Brian Jones into a position that he deserves. So how about you just kicking it off and just telling us about Brian Jones?
Yeah, well, because he's an interesting guy and quite, in a short amount of time, he did a lot of work. So I think it's fair to portray Brian in a 3, maybe 4-part series.
Sure.
Obviously, the first part will be his somewhat unusual upbringing, his love for blues and jazz, his rebellious teenage years, discovering slide guitar, Elmore James, naming the Rolling Stones. That's the first part. I think the second series would be when he dropped the guitar and started playing other instruments, the middle period.
Yep.
And we can even touch on some of the unusual guitars he played. And then maybe the third part, unfortunately, the decline, the rock and roll circus, buying, was it Cotchford Farm, and the famous trip. I'm not sure if his house was southeast, west, north of London, but the famous road trip where they said, "Hey, Cock, you're fired." And ultimately, unfortunately, we'll probably talk about just his death, and then obviously his legacy.
But I think in a weird kind of way, talking about his death will be an interesting thing, because there's a lot of theories, isn't there?
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of theories too about what Brian was doing up until he died. For years and years and years and years, I was under the influence that he was a spent force, he was a has-been, he wasn't doing anything. And then all of a sudden, over the last 5 to 10 years, there's a lot of information out there saying, well, actually, he was inspired, he was getting himself together, and he was on the track of doing something musical. So I look forward to that show.
Yeah, no, we can talk about that a bit later, because reminiscing, I'll touch on it just a little bit. He was talking to not only some English musicians but some American musicians before he died about A, jamming, or B, maybe linking up, working together. So but what I like about Brian is obviously the Rolling Stones were blues lovers. Brian was the original outsider. Most of the Stones were from London or London-based. Brian was from another town. It'd be like, for example, you and I, Keith and Mick, all in Hamilton, and then Brian's from Cambridge, or, what's a snobby little town in Waikato? Yeah, Cambridge or...
Cambridge, yeah.
Yeah. So he was an outsider. And, can you imagine... walking into a club and seeing a 5'7" little guy with blonde bobby hair playing slide like you only heard on the records. Here's someone actually doing it. That's what initially drew people to him. He named himself Elmo Lewis, didn't he, after Elmo James?
That's correct.
And he'd discovered at an early age, being from a musical background, people forget that he had a jazz background or a classical background. His mother was a piano player. His father was a very highly intelligent guy. He was the only stone, I think, that knew how to read music, played saxophone, busked around northern parts of Europe. 4 kids before he was 20. So not only was he was almost from another world compared to very much the Micks and the Keiths, who were at that particular time probably 3 weeks from leaving home, still living with mum and dad. So here's an 18, 19-year-old guy jamming with Alexis Korner, who we know now was what Muddy Waters was to the blues. Alexis Korner was to the British blues, a father figure.
Yeah, well, Alexis certainly had his own interpretation of what blues was, and this is the unique thing about Alexis, because his vision of the blues, as I understand it, certainly wasn't the version of the blues that the Stones were playing early on. But he supported them anyway. He didn't tell them that they were useless or get away or get out of here.
Yeah.
You know, he supported them and gave them enough room, a venue for them to forge their interpretation of the blues.
Yeah. And Alexis was a slide guitar player himself, wasn't he, with the acoustic and the pickup? So,
yeah. Well, I have to be careful here because I don't know a lot about him, but I pick up some of the information that I've read that he was an okay musician. He was an okay guitarist. He wasn't exceptional. He was competent.
He was very much like a John Mayall. He was more known for the people he hung out with as opposed to individual prowess. But these guys were encyclopedias of blues. And one thing Brian, a young, enthusiastic Brian, learned from, and you've taught me this as well, is you ain't nothing without contacts, connections. Mick and Keith didn't have any connections. Brian had all the connections.
And that's a bloody good point, because that's a bloody good point. That you mentioned that, because Alexis was the Google for Brian, wasn't he? He was the Google. He was the encyclopedia that would help Brian dig and delve deeper into his understanding and his research of the blues. But you're right. How old was Brian when he was going to what was Alexis Clubs called? Is it the Flamingo?
Yeah, it wasn't the Marquee. Let's have a look. Half Jewish and half Greek. He formed a band called Blues Incorporated. And he was basically, like you say, he was basically a bit like, what's that guy's name from Hamilton, the Blues Healers, Mike Gardner.
Yeah.
He was one of those, he was like a professor.
Yeah.
He was one of those guys that 10, 20 years older than everybody else, probably had a house, a wife, maybe a couple of kids, but had coffee and whiskey parties and music listening parties, and had just a sheer love for the blues. You know, not the greatest instrumentalist, but was instrumental in bringing everyone together.
Provided the environment. And that's one thing that I'm picking up in that blues, British Blues Network book. It was important that the clubs became venues not only just to watch the music or watch a band or a gig, but to make those connections, to go out and do, further research, to to form other bands. As an aside, just look at Cream. Cream met in other venues, didn't they, before they decided to form? So,
well, I was reading up about before Brian formed the Stones.
Yep.
He was playing in a band called the Roosters, and when he left, Eric replaced him.
Yeah.
So even though London would have been 2 million, the blues community would have been relatively small. But how important and concentrated it was. So your Alexis Corners and your John Mayall's really opened the doors for these guys. But Brian took it a step further by actually making things happen. I mean,
and that's the key. That's the key.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
so can I just clarify something then before we go on further? Brian was performing live while Mick and Keith were still listening to records in the living room.
Playing in the had a little band in the living room with Dick Taylor, I think. You're playing a lot of just Elvis and Buddy Holly.
Okay.
A lot of Chuck Berry.
Okay, but Brian was actually in a sense already a professional musician playing gigs in a club
and playing predominantly blues music.
Cool. I think that's an important thing. That's an important thing for us to remember. Yeah.
Yeah. Because when Rolling Stones were pretty much two bands that combined, because half the band left because they couldn't stand Chuck Berry, because Keith was a Chuck Berry nut. So there was obviously a compromise. We'll do the blues and we'll do the Chuck Berry, which is great because I like Chuck Berry. But yeah, no, Brian, he doesn't get enough credit. We can talk a little bit further down the road about obviously the fact that Mick and Keith had a kindred spirit that goes back a long way since they were 5. But Brian obviously met up with Ian Stewart. He wrote in the magazine there, band members looking to play. Ian Stewart rolled up. It was a process. Mick and Keith were really impressed with the slide playing. Aghast. And we know the famous story about Bill Wyman joining a bit later on because he had 2 amps and always had cigarettes. And I just realised...
So can I just ask you, so they were impressed with his slide playing. Was Brian playing cross harp at that stage? So he would have...
No harp at all.
Okay, cool.
No harp at all. He was playing with his back to the audience, and some people say that it might be a little bit exaggerated. That it was like Elmore James was in the building. That Dust My Blues riff. People's jaws were wide open like this.
Yeah.
So, shit.
Call coming through.
Stupid text.
Oh, it's okay. We can still hear you. That's okay.
But we've talked about this before. There was a lot of bands in that early 60s period that basically sped up the blues, and some of them murdered it. The simple fact that Brian played quite authentic slide guitar separated the Stones from a lot of those English bands. That's another good point. Obviously, there's a lot of good, talented blues players came on a little bit later on, but Brian was the initial blues player. As far as, slide guitar is a really important part of the blues. Marty Waters played slide. Howling Wolf played a little bit of slide. A lot of those guys played slide. So, yeah. So, Brian and Brian's image, they were not fond of, but just Mick and Keith, like, this guy's this guy's doing everything he's playing about. He is a blues man. He's an outsider. He's got 4 kids. He's a runaway, and unfortunately, that kind of haunted him till his last breath. You know. So,
yeah, I remember reading recently too that Ginger Baker was really impressed with Brian Jones early on, because he had a very good ability to pick up on what the crowd was doing. He could, he was a kind of shy kind of guy, but he was able to get the crowd behind whatever he wanted the crowd to do, which again is a unique thing in itself. And again, it's something that we don't hear a lot about, because when people talk about the Rolling Stones, and the front man obviously is Mick Jagger, and then people associate Mick Jagger with the guy that is motivating the crowd. But Ginger Baker and other musicians early on were saying, well, heck, actually the guy that was doing it was Brian.
Yeah, the first 2 years the Stones were playing, the interviewer would go up to Brian. Brian led most of the back and forth questions, answers. Brian, would bring out the tambourine, like you say, and tease the crowd. Mick was actually quite awkward in the beginning. It wasn't till a couple of American tours and studying James Brown he actually started to get him a few moves down.
I just want to do a shout out, buddy, to a few cats in the chat. So we've got Pooh Ninja, Todd, g'day Todd, Jimmy T, we've already said g'day to, but it's always nice to say g'day back to him. Arvin Gaunt, good to see you, Arvin. Thank you for joining us. But I just want to reiterate a comment here that Jimmy T has made. The slide gave them a bit of, so the slide gave them a bit more blues authenticity. So I would agree with that. And Brian was clever enough to know that if you're going to play the blues, you have to play the slide.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, how many Chuck Berry songs can you play, or how many Jimmy Reed songs can you play where it sounds pretty repetitive? His slide work and I Want to Be Your Man, Can't Be Satisfied, and obviously Little Red Rooster was a #1 song, first #1 song by a white blues band. It's unbelievable.
Well, absolutely. So speaking about playing a bit of slide, let's see if I can. Hold on. Hold on, it's been a long time. Hold on.
Robert Johnson.
No. I'm trying to play Can't Be Satisfied. Is that not coming through?
It sounds good.
Guitar's probably not tuned. It's been in the sun all day. But yeah, I agree with you. Playing the blues, you got to play the slide.
And let's face it, I mean, and we've talked about this before. You got a lot of keen ears, not in England but in America. So there would have been a lot of talent scouts, arrangers, producers, record labels looking at the Stones, not only looking at them as a cash cow, but looking at their blues, especially Brian's skill. That sort of skill got them into Chess Studios.
I think that's another great point that I haven't picked up on. So yeah, and I think we need to probably highlight that. So while the record company was listening to this music and realizing that there was something there was a market for it. It was the guys actually playing the blues themselves
as well, yeah,
who could hear a bit of themselves, I suppose, in this music, which gave them probably a reason to respect them a little bit more.
Well, it as we've talked about this before, I mean, obviously they were called race records and segregated. The Stones breathed new life into these blues guys in America, and the Stones were only trying to emulate their idols. But the simple fact that Brian played quite authentic guitar, and Keith wasn't no slouch either, and Mick had a very, very good voice. And by the way, they were extremely lucky to get Charlie Watts. So I did a bit of research. Charlie Watts was one of the better drummers in all of London. When we think of great drummers, most great drummers have a jazz background. So they're very fortunate to get Charlie. Very fortunate.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's okay for us to talk about Brian, because we have to make it quite clear to people in the chat and anybody who watches the replay, the praise and the criticism that we're going to talk about in regards to Brian in no way diminishes our respect and admiration for the other Rolling Stones. It's just that we just want to solely focus on Brian's contribution and his achievements and probably some of his failures, because there were some big ones.
Yeah. I mean, so the first two records, I'm a King Bee, that stunning slide. Oh, and by the way, so I won't get too off track.
No, it's fine.
yeah. So much to talk about. So as it turned out, after obviously them all meeting and then obviously rehearsing, and then the famous story about, okay, we're going to book you. We've heard a few things. What's your name? And that famous story of the telephone booth and the Rolling Stone Muddy Waters record on the ground, and track number 5, Rolling Stone, they added a G, which Brian obviously named.
Yep.
But a couple of things. Their sound really became forged and synchronized in that 6 to 8 month period at Edith Grove, which, by the way, they've actually done a mock setup of the place. You can find it on YouTube. It literally was a dump. And it got Mick and Keith's seal of approval because they recreated exactly how it was.
Yeah.
It was amazing. One of the coldest winters England ever had, but they started the guitar weaving. Mick was still going to school. Brian was clever enough to say, you know what? We've got the slide down. We're doing this Jimmy Reed guitar weaving. What about the harmonica? And there's a famous story. I guess they had to go up some stairs to get to the flat. And Brian, who obviously wasn't working, Keith wasn't working, they were accepting donations and bludging, basically. And Brian had an old buddy from school that stayed. And
pinching.
Brian had figured out
they were good thieves.
Brian had figured out the harmonica, and Keith and Mick's exact words was all these blues notes were coming out.
Wow.
So we know that Mick obviously played harmonica later on, and Mick plays harmonica very well. But Brian taught Mick the harmonica. Brian taught him the breathing, how to bend notes, the cross harp. Those early records, it was mainly Brian playing the harp until Mick got the confidence to play on his own.
So what year was this? What year did Brian decide to learn to play the harp?
62, Edith Grove.
62.
Yeah.
Wow.
So not only did he take a back seat and just say, I'll do rhythm, Keith, you do most of the leads. He did most of the slide duty. He did that incredible Bo Diddley stuff that Bo Diddley said that he was the only guy that could get his sound down, which was not easy. Mona, not fade away, that sort of thing. But he also brought in the authenticity of a harmonica, which which is an integral part of the blues. Let's face it, the Mississippi saxophone. So, yeah. So to all these other young guys, can you imagine going to Biddy Mulligan's or a young pub, and there's some young band that's really hot, and there's someone playing slide, and then he switches to harp, and then he switches to rhythm. It would have been just really impressive.
I'm just trying to find. I am listening to you, my friend, but I'm just trying to find some information on this harp playing, because I just assumed that it was something that he picked up when he was learning the guitar. I wasn't aware that he was, you know, already a musician and decided that he would learn to play the harmonica, because that would have been certainly something that he learnt only by ear.
Well, he's a clever guy. We saw him a lot tuning his guitar with the harp. So his harp was like his put in his pocket, his guitar tuner. He was just a very clever guy with a great ear.
Hey, Gussie, I'm just going to do a shout out, mate, while Gussie and Todd Flowers. G'day, Todd. I haven't said g'day to those guys, and everybody else is in the chat, so that's really cool. So I'm just carry on talking, buddy. You just carry on while I'm flicking. I just want to find out some more information on this blinking harp playing.
And not to mention too, in addition to being the band leader, organising the gigs, the connections, the slide, the harp, he was even trying his hand at backup vocals. A lot of people don't know it's him on backup vocals on that first album. He had quite a good voice too. So, yeah,
I'm going to have to do some research on this blinking harmonica playing, because so is there any truth that Little Red Rooster, the slide was added afterwards, after the song had been recorded?
Yeah, I've read that it was the early stages of the band trying to alienate him a little bit. You know, there were stories that he was a bit neurotic, washing his hair all the time. He was paying himself a bit more. He'd stay in different hotel rooms. He was a bit more of a socialite. He was introverted one day, extroverted the next. So they laid down the backing track and they left a note in the studio saying, just play your slide part. I've read that. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But the main thing is it's on record and it's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, a really, really neat job from the whole band, actually. Yeah, so, and his main weapons of choice at that particular time was the Gretsch, wasn't it?
Yeah. So we're talking about 62, are we?
Yeah. So Gretsch was his main guitar there for a while.
Okay, so according to the information I have here, so yeah, he was playing, like a lot of them, they had Valencia guitars early on, and they were playing harmony amplifiers, and a real Brian had a harmony guitar.
Yep.
Which is that.
Were they a Gibson copy? Were they?
I haven't read much about it, but well, look, you can tell it's a bit of a Les Paul.
Humbuckers.
Oh gosh, mate, you want me to speed read? So 62, he's playing a harmony, and so okay, and then they're playing Vox. So hold on, so we're up to 63, and he's still playing another harmony, and Keith's playing a harmony. 63. So that they're still playing harmonies. Okay, so 63, he gets his Gretsch.
Wow.
Almost immediately following the Olympic Studios Come On session, Brian Jones retires his Serotonin, or whatever that is, and replaces his harmony with a green Gretsch anniversary model.
Which would have been not cheap in those days.
So, for the sake of the viewers, so that's the Gretsch there. That one of the guitars that he's famous for. Brian brought the Gretsch from Bob Adams at Sound Studio in London. But it doesn't say. Oh, okay. So here we go. The guitar was later. Okay, so in 2009. Christie's sold the guitar for £80,000.
Brian's original guitar.
Yeah.
Wow. Which times 3, 840,000 New Zealand dollars.
But it doesn't give us a bloody price of how much it was when it was brand new. So.
Well, it would have been equivalent to probably 3,000 New Zealand dollars back in those days. Probably £1,000. Who knows? Probably 2 or 3 months' wages.
Oh, easy.
It might have been a lay-by. Hire purchase, or pay you back later.
Yeah, so I just want to have a chat to the guys in the chat, mate. So the guys in the chat last night had a good chat in our chat. And they're talking about it because they had a good chat last night and we weren't there in our chat, enjoying them talking about good stuff in the chat. And someone's got a new, what's a Sen, Gussie, what's a Sennheiser? Is that a microphone? Sennheiser. Holy crap, they were chatting for 2 hours, buddy. Yeah, look, I don't know if we want to be talking about Brian Jones's guitars now, but why not? So Brian had a reputation for playing a lot of different guitars, certainly live. So was Brian one of the original guys that had guitar acquisition syndrome, or was he searching for a tone, or was he a guy that just got bored with guitars easily and just felt the challenge of having to use another guitar? You got any theories on that?
I just think that, especially with a lot of Keith's Chuck Berry style of playing, I think you don't agree, but I've given it a bit of thought. Brian had a very good ear, keen ear. He played the Vox because it had single pickups, not doubles. The Gretsch as well had more of a rockabilly bright sound. So he was clever enough to, when you hear things like Around and Around, you can hear his rhythm quite clear because it's quite bright and up the top. Where Keith's sound is very thick, his rhythm and his lead, which is the humbucker sound. So I think Brian was clever enough to try and cut through that wall of sound with having a single pickup. That's what I think. I mean, the Vox is basically a tear-shaped Stratocaster, isn't it? A really stripped-down version. Bizarre guitar, but I kind of like them. Just because it's, I mean, that's another thing. I mean, there's a guy on YouTube, and they were just like, playing all the famous axes from all the musicians. And one of the guys like, this is just beyond legendary, playing Brian's original Vox, which is still around. So I think Brian did have a good ear. So it's your view that they
they were playing different guitars because they were doing the famous weaving. So it was important for them to be able to have a distinguished sound between the two guitars that they could hear in the first place.
Yeah, yeah.
It was important for them to distinguish the two guitars.
Yeah, it's a bit of an oxymoron because they played together, but Brian's sound was a fraction brighter. So it was, yeah. So I guess the word I've heard before from audiophiles is they didn't want it to sound muddy or what's the other, grainy. So Brian's guitar had a bit of bite, which is quite good. And that's what you get with a single pickup. But then it kind of, we'll talk about this a bit later. Then it kind of changed, obviously, with the Firebirds and the Rickenbackers. We'll talk about that in the second period. But initially, and I think also Brian being a 5'6", 5'7" little guy, that Gretsch was a pretty big guitar, wasn't it?
Yeah, certainly a big guitar, and I've had a Gretsch, you know, a modern Gretsch, you know.
You still got it?
No, and it, yeah, it's a big guitar, certainly because it's a hollow body, but not heavy.
Okay. Because imagine he for a couple of years he played that Vox pretty religiously, didn't he?
Yeah, well, this is something I suppose that we probably should be doing some research on for some other programs, for other shows that we do. But it'll be interesting to work out or find what guitars he actually used, if there's any information out there. And I suppose someone that can really help us with that is Dave, and he's not with us in the chat. But I'll send him a message later, and Dave watches the replays anyway. So that might be something that Dave might have some information on, because he's a Brian Jones nut. So yeah, and because we're a guitar show, it would be just great to know that he was playing on this album, on these songs, that Vox Teardrop that you love so much.
Yeah, I think it's really quite hazy what he's done in the studios, and it's unfortunate. But there are some famous pictures of him in the studio with a guitar. Namely, I've seen the Firebird and the Rickenbacker in the studio.
Yeah,
but it does get a bit hazy because Keith, I think, is guilty of turning his guitar way up. And because they play the interweaving style, you don't know who's doing what. But we clearly know that Keith does the majority of the Chuck Berry style playing. But
yeah, and here's those Firebirds that you're talking about. You know, there's Keith with his one that Gibson gave them when they were touring America.
Wow. And people don't realise this, but those Flying V's and Firebirds and that have been around since about 59, 60. So, yeah. And they were trying to get a push, weren't they? Because Tellys and that were doing really well. Push and Strats were doing really well with the surf guitar sound.
But they do look cool, though, don't they? So you know, there's Keith there with his one, and this one here, that's a photo of Brian. They are cool. I've never played one in my life. Have you ever played one?
I almost bought one before I came back.
Really?
I almost bought one. You can get them new, cheap in America. New. I think they're cheap because they're 2 slabs of meat, not one. It's 2 pieces of wood.
Oh, I haven't even played an Epiphone one, so
yeah,
I just I love them.
I mean, let's not forget Johnny Winter.
No.
And Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton had one with just one pickup.
Yeah.
Crazy.
I just want to do a shout out. So Wednesday Store has joined us. Hey, Wednesday. You're right. Harmony guitars were considered to be starter instruments. And I suppose, to be fair, for a lot of the English cats, they had, if I remember rightly, they had a trade embargo or there was a tax rate. So anything that was American was priced generally off the planet for a lot of guys. So that's why you had a lot of the cheaper European style guitars, and the Beatles obviously too played a lot of those cheap guitars because they couldn't afford the quality American gear.
Speaking of the Beatles, and obviously Brian's influence on a lot of players, and George and John being very good guitar players, but who was George the slide player in the band?
What was that? Sorry, buddy, I missed that. What did you say?
Speaking of Brian and his skill on the slide and his influence on other people, and the Beatles and John and George being very good guitar players.
Yeah.
Was George Harrison the slide player in the Beatles band?
Well, I know that he played slide on Let It Be, but no, that was later on. So that was 68, 69. He was playing slide that I know of,
Okay.
and he would have probably picked that up from Eric, hanging out with Eric, and
Yeah.
just probably wanting to try something different. But he Wednesday Store adds an interesting comment. He says he thinks Brian must have robbed someone to get that Gretsch. Well, we're not going to probably we can't discount that because in this book here, the Paul Trinket does talk about the Rolling Stones being good thieves.
Songs?
No, pinching things.
Well, I think he got someone's cufflinks. And here's another interesting point.
Hey, Quentin.
So Brian obviously was playing a lot of slide, and our so-called guitar heroes, the Jimmy Page, the Eric Claptons, they didn't really play slide till a lot later on. Was Eric playing slide with the Blues Breakers? Not really,
No, not at all.
He did a little bit with the Cream, didn't he? Just a little bit.
Yes.
But it wasn't until he went solo that he actually really took it seriously.
A lot of these guys took the slide up because of the Rolling Stones, Let It Bleed, Biggest Banquet, and how many songs are have slide on those albums?
Yeah,
over half a dozen.
And speaking of slide, obviously Keith learned to play slide later on because obviously Brian wasn't in the studio much. And, Jigsaw Puzzle Blues, Let It Bleed. What else did he do slide on in the early days? Odds and ends. But Keith wasn't a bad slide player, but he would have got that confidence and learned from Brian. But it gave those songs a beautiful mix, didn't it, that slide playing?
Well, absolutely. And I would recommend everyone in the chat, if you go back and listen to Little Red Rooster, the Rolling Stones version, just listen to that. And, that's a guy that taught himself to play slide, and
alternative tunings.
Yeah, and worked out the tuning because it's not played in standard. And yeah, it's pretty good. It's probably a foundation song for so many different aspects of music, isn't it? Not just slide, but yeah. But we can talk about those and other issues, episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting because Peter Green played a little bit of slide, a little bit with Fleetwood Mac, but Brian really was at the forefront of being one of the guys mentioned bring authenticity. He gave it a go. he gave it a go, and the history is in his music and in his work. So, and yeah, right up to the Beggars Banquet.
I remember asking Dave this, and I don't know if we spoke about this in any shows last year, but Dave is an English guy who's a Stones nut. In particular, he loves Brian Jones, and he's quite keen to get a tribute band going in England, concentrating on the Brian Jones era. So we all wish him luck in that venture, and hopefully we can get him on some shows. That's what Carl and I would like to do. Maybe if not next week, the week after or the week after, we'd love to get him on because he's got some good gear that and some good stories that he can share with us. But what's really interesting is I said to him, what is it about you English guys and the blues? And he laughed and he said, I think in regards to Eric Clapton and Peter Green and Brian Jones and Keith Richards and all these guys that we love, they probably had OCD or something like that. You know, they were obsessive, and they would go into their room and spend hours in their room and come out and be bloody good guitar players.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it was pretty competitive. There's probably lots and lots and lots of very average bands and very, very few good bands. And those good bands would have been probably 20% talent and 80% enthusiasm and work ethic. So, yeah, they would have been practicing a lot. I mean, Keith always had a guitar in his hand. Every photo you take, he was on the road.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he talks about his love of the guitar in his book, Life. He just had to have the guitar. But Todd's making another interesting comment, Carl, in the chat. Is this why the Stones use open tunings to this day? So Carl and I have mentioned this before in other programs that we've put up, but there's enough evidence out there, Todd, to say that Brian Jones was the first guy to teach Keith Richards open tuning. And Keith Richards talks about how Ry Cooder was the person that showed him open G tuning in his biography. But Paul Trinker gives us some arguments to say, well, heck, you know, we're talking about two guys that hung out together, that played guitar for hours together. Are you telling me that Brian Jones didn't teach or show Keith Richards how to tune the guitar in open D?
Yeah. It's a funny one. It's a bit of a mystery because it's almost like there's a big gap of unanswered questions.
You know, as much as I love Keith Richards, you know, he's jeepers, you know, if I had the guts, I'd get a Keith Richards tattoo. But it's important, I suppose, for his legacy, for him to say, well, look, you know, the open G tuning is such a big part of his legacy to rock and roll. He couldn't say that actually it was Brian Jones. Yeah, because probably straight away that's going to put the heat back onto Brian Jones as an innovator. So, yeah, that's just.
I get the feeling.
It's just an opinion.
I also get the feeling that Brian made Keith a better guitar player because with Brian, everything came easy. He could play multitudes of instruments. He could play by ear. He'd figured out the harp. He'd figured out open tunings. He'd figured out slide. If he really wanted to pull a lead solo, he probably could, but he didn't. Gave Keith the floor. So Keith had to work a lot harder, I think, in retrospect, to be a good guitar player.
Oh, and Wednesday Store makes a good point because he thinks that Keith prolonged his career by 15 years by using open tuning. Very smart. I totally agree with you. You know, the open G tuning for those songs that we all love, on Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street. Jeepers, he's doing something different, isn't he?
But he also had a helping hand.
Yeah. The point that Carl and I are making is that we tend to agree that Brian Jones is the one that showed him how to do open tuning, as opposed to Ry Cooder. We can't prove it, but we're just using Paul Trinker's book, which if you guys want to check that out, he offers some good arguments to say, well, look, hey, this is what happened.
Yeah, and like I said, Keith's a wonderful guitar player, but I think that he really had to work really hard. Looking back and listening to a lot of Stones music, Brian played a lot of stuff that you couldn't quite hear because he amalgamated his sound with the bass player, and he was the anchor of the band. Like Time Was On My Side, you can hear Keith very clearly.
Yep.
But Brian was doing the Apprigio part, and that's basically holds it all together. Brian was a very clever guy, so he never really took the limelight as far as out in front, big lead solos. But he was clever enough to know that the blues and any good rock and roll R&B music had a rhythmic background, a rhythmic bass. The Stones were the first band to really swing. Brian was part of that swing. So yeah. I mean, Brian, the Stones today, as we speak, 2019, 75 years old, countless tours, countless records. Brian was a bedrock of that identity. It's just a shame they don't mention him more. I mean, I think it's a real sore point, probably very deep. You imagine a very good friend, someone you looked up to, someone you're very close, spent a lot of time, a lot of tours, fade away, self-destruct. Probably to this day, still pretty deep.
Well, I promise I'll do some research for the next show, because there's another book that Dave has mentioned to me that we need to check out, and it's by a guy that used to live with them or hung out with them at Edith Grove, and he's sharing a lot of stories and information about what they used to get up to. So the information and the research is coming out. That's going to counterbalance the cosmopolitan view that the Rolling Stones is and was Keith and Mick. I've had chats with people on Facebook, that have said, no, the Rolling Stones were started by Mick and Keith. And of course, you don't want to get upset and call them names or anything like that, because people have to begin somewhere when they learn something, and it's not someone's fault that they've been given the wrong information. You have to be nice and gentle and say, well, actually, it's Brian Jones's band.
So, it is, yeah.
And I've been corrected hundreds of times through social media, and that's the great thing about social media, is that someone can say, well, actually, no, Cream started it in 1966, it wasn't 1968. Oh, okay, Led Zeppelin is a band, not a man. Yeah. So
no, that first, it's very exciting when you listen to those first records. The excitement, the enthusiasm. Obviously, you can hear their youth. Obviously, they honed their sound later on, and obviously, we can talk about this a little bit later. The Mick and Keith songwriting partnership that would eventually become, wrote hit songs. But the first few years, let's face it, were the driving force of Brian Jones.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm mindful of the time that you've got
Yep.
an appointment to attend to. So I just want to do a shout out to Sonia, who has saying she said that she really enjoys this channel and the in-depth conversations discussing so much. Thank you, Sonia. And Gussie too, jumping in saying that he agrees. And Jimmy T, Carl and I enjoy your support, and we enjoy the comments that you guys give, and the encouragement in the chat. So we look forward to next week's show. I've got some research to do.
Yep.
And we're going to talk about some gear that Brian used from what era, Carl?
So this show we did today is basically 62 to 64.
Okay, so we're going to go from 64 to
66. Oh, sorry. 62 to 64. We're going to go from 65 to 67.
Okay, and do we want to talk about some tours?
Absolutely. We'll talk about some tours and the simple fact that Brian started to drop the guitar.
Okay, and if anyone hasn't seen any of the footage, or if you want to get a copy, check out Charlie Is My Darling, which is the tour to Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
When was that? 64 or 65?
On the cusp, late 64, early 65. Yeah. Yeah, not quite sure. Very early.
Yeah, we'll do some research on that, but you guys need to check that out if you get some time, because it's it's brilliant. It's fascinating. It's a good documentary of what was happening at the time.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So I'm going to say thanks, guys, for joining us, and Carl and I will be back next Monday. And we promise that if we can't make any shows, I'll jump in the chat and I'll have a 2-hour chat party with you guys.
Yeah. And I'd just like to close this. So this series is basically not only Brian, but we're going to talk about the 3 different guitar players that the Stones have had from day one to today. Obviously, because Brian's such an interesting guy, there's a lot to talk about. So it'll be either the 3-4-part series.
Yep.
We'll talk about Mick Taylor and his role and what his guitar did to the sound.
Yes.
That might be 1 show, possibly 2. I think Ron Wood's impact would be just the 1 show, because, a clever guy, slide, but the Stones were pretty much established then. There was nothing really he added. Personally, I don't think.
No, and
I mean, he's a good player, but Stones were already established.
Yeah, and they'd already decided that they were going to be a stadium touring band.
Yeah, I mean, case in point, an 81 or 89 tour set list, pretty predictable. 3-4 songs off the new album, a couple of classics at the start, a couple of Chuck Berrys in the middle, and then you have classics at the end with the encore.
Yeah. Brown sugar.
What I like about Brian is we're talking about the formation of this exciting thing that was a baby that was growing. Yeah.
Well, these blues guys talk about it in almost religious terms. The Winwood Clapton DVD that came out in 2008. They're interviewing Steve Winwood, and he was talking about how he was 16 or 15 when he came to London, and all these guys were older and they were listening to the blues, and it was almost as if, they were there on a mission. They were there to spread this music that had such an impact on them. Clapton talks about that at length too. Heck, Keith Richards spends a chapter in his book talking about how they were on this mission to spread the blues, and I kind of caught their bug.
Yeah, no, it's great. And what I'll do, and I'm pretty excited because I've gave it a little bit of thought, and I won't talk about it now, but 3 different gave the band 3 different types of sound. And I'll talk about it in the later part of the series of what Brian did as far as a certain sound. And a lot of it had to do with just the time and technology too.
Look forward to that, man.
But
I look forward to it. Awesome. Okay,
Yeah,
so I'm going to say goodbye for the 3rd time. And I'll leave the final
Happy
word.
New Year.
And I'll leave the final word up to you, buddy.
Yeah, just Happy New Year, everybody. Unfortunately, with my particular job, I was telling Andrew today, I get random texts and calls about people wanting to do something on the spot. So,
and he's not a gigolo either. Okay, the rumor that Carl's a gigolo is not true.
Yeah. But actually, over the summer break, I've actually done a lot of just reminiscing about my early Stones, my love for the Stones and all their different phases. And I will say there are certain people out there that want to make Brian bigger than what he is. Brian was just like all of us, a mere man, but a really fascinating figure that we'll explore too in the next few weeks.
Awesome, buddy.
Thank you.